Oh, well, hello everyone, and good afternoon to everyone here in the United States. And yeah, good afternoon to everyone there in the United States. My name is William Davis, and I'm the Director of Education for Wilson Daniels. And we are going to take a day forward because we are going to be joined here in just a moment by Michael Brajkovich, the winemaker and patriarch, I suppose, of the Kumeu River winery in Auckland, or actually specifically in Kumeu itself. So I'm waiting for him to come on the other side of the world. It's 8 a.m. there, and he's going to walk us through the vineyard. So thanks again for everybody joining us. Naturally, feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have of Michael as we walk through the vineyards. But I am going to get him on in right now. So let's give him just a second since we are traveling about 8,000 miles. And there he is, bright and early on a Friday morning. How are you, Michael?
Morning, William. Very well, thank you. It's a little bit cloudy and overcast here today. It's not blue sky, but there we have the vineyard in the background. So we're all set to go.
There it certainly is. But then again, it was a little sunnier when we checked in on the connection last week. But you need those clouds. After all, we all need a little bit of precipitation. It's not all going to be sunny skies, right?
That's right. It's coming right into autumn now, and you can see by the color of the leaves behind me that we've lost a few leaves since last week. It's been a bit windy and a bit cold, and this particular vineyard has no virus disease in it at all. So once you get into dormancy after harvest, those leaves fall off pretty quickly.
Well, great. And for everyone out there, tell us exactly what vineyard that you're in.
Well, I'm standing in the Hunting Hill vineyard, Chardonnay vineyard, that's right behind me. Adjacent to it, just up the hill, is the Hunting Hill Pinot Noir vineyard. And if I just show you a shot down the other side here, down on the flat there, that bright golden piece of vineyard coming around there, that is Matty's vineyard. So that's down by the main highway. We're up the hill a bit here on Hunting Hill, but these are two of our, well, they are the two best known of our Chardonnay vineyards. Matty's vineyard down there, and back up here is Hunting Hill.
Yeah, I believe I've got it on the inset. So that would be the entrance to the Matty's vineyard. So,
that's right. So, yep.
No, you were going to say. I mean, it's.
Yeah, that's a view coming up the hill. So where I'm standing is about halfway in that photograph, just behind that stand of trees.
I see.
That photograph was taken a few years ago, so the trees have grown a bit since then, and but it's pretty much the same terroir.
So we've got you for just under an hour, and there's so much history associated with Kumeu, specifically in the wine world for New Zealand and the emerging market that it's become around the world. But you focusing on Chardonnay as opposed to Sauvignon Blanc, or at least the grape variety that most consumers are familiar with in the United States. But you're also the first MW in New Zealand. So I have to ask, because that was a few years ago, how did that come about, and how did the New Zealand wine community respond to that award and accolade?
Well, I had become aware of the Institute of Masters of Wine and that qualification when I was still a student at Roseworthy College. So we'd heard about these people and the kind of knowledge that they have. During the 1980s, I got to meet quite a few of the MW group, and in 1986, when I was involved in judging at the Air New Zealand Wine Awards at the Chateau Tongariro, our guest overseas judge was Sarah Morphew Stephen, who was the first woman to pass the Master of Wine exam in 1971. And judging with her, she took me aside after one day and said, have you ever thought of doing the exam for the Master of Wine? And quite honestly hadn't, because I thought it was only open to the British wine trade. And she said then, because she was then chair of the institute, that they were going to open it up to international candidates very shortly. So, in fact, in 1987, it was opened up. And in 1988, Michael Hillsmith from Australia became the first international Master of Wine. I passed the exam the following year, 1989. I was the first New Zealander to gain that qualification. So in terms of the impact on me and on us, it gave a lot of credibility to the things that we were starting to do here in the vineyard and in the winery, because if you're going to do the MW exam, you need to know and understand what the world of wine is, where we fit in the world of wine, and what we can do to go for the heights. Because at the time, a lot of the concentration in New Zealand was on variety Muller Thurgau. We're only just starting to get into Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay and other varieties like that. And it was concentrating on those varieties that do well in our environment that really shot us forward very quickly.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned about many of these hybrids in the nascent period of New Zealand winemaking and wine and grape growing.
Yeah.
So let's actually go back a little further and start off with where the winery began.
Well, the winery here dates back to 1944, when my father and his family came to Kumeu. They were immigrants from Croatia, and my grandfather had worked in New Zealand back in the early 1900s as a gum digger in the far north, Kauri gum digger. He went back to what was then Yugoslavia, back to the Dalmatian coast, got married, started a family, but then things got pretty bad in that part of the world, and he decided to up stakes and head back out here, but left the family behind. Later on, nearly a year later, he managed to raise enough money and to bring my grandmother, my father and his two sisters out to New Zealand. And they went on the gum fields for a few years, but then realised there was no future in that, and that they needed really to get on the land and grow something. So they then moved down to Auckland, lived and worked around the Henderson area until they had saved up enough money to buy this property in 1944. They were very lucky to leave Europe in 1938, ahead of World War II. So they managed to miss out on all the hardship that went on in that part of the world during World War II. But they got here, and it was a mixed farm that they bought from another Dalmatian family, and they grew pumpkins, they grew apples and peaches, they milked cows, and that was the income that they had. But one of the attractions of the property was that it had a small vineyard and it had a winemaker's license. So right from the start, right from 1944, they started to make wine. And in those days, most of the market in New Zealand was fortified wines, but Dad really did want to make high quality red initially, but also white table wine, and that became the aim right through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s.
So what was originally planted in 1944? Was it Muller, or was it a blend of different varieties?
No, there was no Muller. It was only about a half an acre vineyard. It wasn't very big at all. It was a variety called Albany Surprise. Now, Albany Surprise is a Vitis labruscana.
Yeah.
So it's from New York State.
Yeah.
And it was grown here both as a table grape variety, but also for making wine. It didn't make very good wine. So it was, in later years, Dad planted on the other side of the road. So what is now Matty's Vineyard was planted to quite a mixture of grape varieties for the various types of wines that he started to make. And prominent in that was the Palomino grape variety. So Palomino, as you know, is a grape variety of sherry. Right. And in those days, a big part of our production was fortified sherry and port style wines. But it was a versatile variety because we could also make table wine from it. But we also had Barco 22O was another great variety that was popular at the time. That's a true French hybrid. We also planted some Muller Thurgau, We had a variety called Pinotage, which you know from South Africa, and a number of other hybrids like Cybele 5455 and Cybele 5437, which didn't make particularly good wine, but they were very easy to grow, and they resisted disease, which has always been a problem in this region because we are very much a cool climate, and it can be fairly wet here as well. So we are right on the edge, really, of viticultural sustainability, but we manage that through various techniques in the vineyard and the winery to be able to make nowadays high quality table wine.
Yeah, you mentioned with that Cybele, it's because I've actually got a photo, an image of some of the frost challenges that you see in your vineyards and in that region. So definitely need those New York kind of driven either hybrids, those cold hardy varieties. Now let's move forward into the early 90s, because you were one of the first to champion the use of screw cap. So let's go a little bit into how you came to that decision and how well it's worked for you, because you've been working with screw cap exclusively for the wines for almost 20 years now, right?
Yes, it's just on 20 years. Well, I became aware of screw cap technology back when I was at Roseworthy College, and that's 1979, 1980, 81. Because our head of school was Dr. Bryce Rankin, who did a lot of the original research in Australia into alternative closures. And one of the closures that they looked at was what was then called Stelcap. So Stelcap was a French invention by the Pétionnet company, and they adapted it and started manufacturing it in Australia. And it was the name Stelvin was just an agglomeration of the two words, Stelcap Vin, and the Aussies, being Aussies, shortened the name, called it Stelvin, and the rest, as they say, is history. But the liner that they were investigating at the time was the one that has actually become the most popular. It is a sarin tin liner, so it has a layer of polyvinylidene chloride, which is in contact with the wine, backed by a tin liner, a tin layer, which is a very good oxygen barrier. And then behind that is expanded polyethylene as a wad, and that sits inside an aluminium cap, and that's applied to the bottle top. And it worked very well back then. It still works very well now. The Australian industry did toy with it for a while in the late 70s and early 80s. And quite a few of those wines existed over the next 20 years. And I was very fortunate to be able to taste quite a few of those early Riesling examples from Eden Valley, from people like Yalumba, who went into it in quite a big way, and could see the type of bottle development you were seeing after 10 years age. And that kind of bottle development was exactly the same as you get with a high quality cork. So we knew from the start that if we started to use that closure on our white wines, we were going to get the same type of bottle maturation that you get with a high quality cork. And when we had a number of problems in the 80s, particularly in the late 80s, and then right through the 90s with cork taint, but also with oxidation, we were looking for alternatives and reluctant to go down that path because of perceived market resistance, but also the absence of the equipment to be able to apply the closure to bottles. And it wasn't really until a group of winemakers in the Clare Valley in 2000 decided to bottle a big chunk of their Riesling production under screw cap that we, as a group in New Zealand, were encouraged to look at the same type of thing. We looked at a number of alternative closures. We had trialled the various plastic type things, the Supreme Cork and things like that earlier on, but found them wanting in terms of oxidation. So there was a group of us winemakers around New Zealand who decided to try the Stelvin closure out, and it's worked extremely well. So we got together as a screw cap initiative and started to promote the idea worldwide. And I've got to say it's been very successful from our point of view, but I'm surprised more winemakers around the world haven't taken it up, really, because it works extremely well. We have 20 years experience with it now, as you mentioned, and we wouldn't use anything else.
Yeah, and you've seen some evolution in how they're produced and what you're able to allow in terms of oxygen intake. So it is
Yep.
surprising to me how, why more producers don't go down that avenue. And thank goodness that we don't have the old plastic ones. Anyone that tried to
Yeah.
open up a bottle with those old plastic corks, they know how much of a challenge it was.
And they didn't have very good oxygen barrier properties. It's a popular misconception that wine needs oxygen through the closure to age properly, because the aging in bottle is not an oxidative process, it's a reductive process. So it occurs in the absence of oxygen, not because of it. And the whole idea of having a closure is to keep air out, not to allow it in. So the very best corks still are a better oxygen barrier than your average screw cap, but the screw caps operate in that very tight end of the cork range, in the top 5% really. But cork, being a natural product, has a lot of variability, and cork taint aside, there is still major issues with oxygen ingress, and the so-called premature oxidation of wines such as white Burgundy has become a huge issue, and it's not about most other factors, it's really about the closure.
Well, it's funny that you brought that up about Premox in other regions. There's a lot of different theories about Premox. Were these similar issues that you had in the late 80s, early 90s in terms of
Yes.
winemaking as opposed to it being a closure issue?
No, really it comes down to the closure, because there are a lot of different things you can do in winemaking and viticulture. But when you have a case of wine, often very expensive wine, and 10 years later you start to open bottles from it, and you get one bottle that's looking a little bit dull, a little bit oxidized, didn't taste like the one you had 10 years before, and then you open another one and it's corked, then you open a third one and it's oxidized but worse than the first one, then you open the fourth bottle out of the same box and it's perfect, it's singing. The only difference between those four bottles is the cork. So all those other factors that people talk about pale into insignificance.
Well, it's funny because I've got a bottle of 2013 Coddington that I pulled out of the cellar that I'm drinking right now, and there's no issue with it at 7 years of age now. It's got so much life left in it, and it really is a testament to that consistency you find with the screw cap. Now,
but it does have aged characters.
Yes,
that's the other thing. It doesn't taste now what it tasted like 7 years ago.
True. Yeah, I mean, there's none of those, what I would call a reductive note in the wine. You do start to now see some of the tertiary notes, and it's just not all, fruit and primary and very upfront. So, with you in the vineyards now, I know you talked about, where you're located in relation to the coast and either ocean. What makes Kumeu and the Huapai sub-GI so unique compared to other GIs in New Zealand?
Well, we're here by historical accident, really. This land was all gum land. It's all heavy clay, close to a population centre, and this is where people settled because the land was available. There was a community here. People were farming and doing other things, and we had orchards in this district. We had dairy farms. But viticulture was just one of the things that happened, and one of the advantages we have is that the oceans are so close either side. It's also one of our disadvantages, because even though we're a long way north in New Zealand, we still get the cooling effect of the ocean. To the west, the ocean's only about 8 miles away. To the east, it's about 12 miles away. So it's very close by, and we do get influenced by it. But it does keep our rainfall up and our cloud cover, as you can see above me, quite high. And that keeps temperatures down. So in degrees Celsius, for us, 30 degrees Celsius is a very hot day, and we get one or maybe two a year. This year we had one day at 30 degrees. Everything else was between 25 to 28 degrees. So it's not hot, but it's not particularly cold either. We do get frost in the spring, and that's because we're in a bit of a valley, and if we get a cloudless night, we have the danger of a radiation frost, and the only way we can control it on this site is with helicopters. On another site we do have a wind machine to be able to help with that. So it's definitely in the cool climate viticulture spectrum, whichever way you want to take that measurement.
So no aspersion. It's only the helicopters that you're going to use on the vineyard.
Exactly. On this particular site, we can only use helicopters,
Nice.
Which is very expensive, so we don't want to do it very often. It's very disruptive of the neighbours. So it's only done as a last resort. The last time we had to fly was a couple of years ago now. We only did it one night, and it really did work. But we've had examples here where we've lost about half the crop. 2010 and 2013, the one you're tasting now, that was a year where we only had about half a crop due to quite a severe frost that year.
Well, I'm glad to be tasting it and actually pulling it out of the cellar. Now, you talked about your vineyards, but you're also working with a few vineyards from growers and friends
Yes.
in the area. So tell us a little bit about the breakdown of that and where some of the grapes go into the finished wines.
Well, we grow about 3/4 of our own production. The rest come from growers, and we have growers both here in Kumeu and in the Hawke's Bay. So in terms of growers in Kumeu, we purchase Pinot Noir, we purchase Chardonnay and Pinot Gris. The only single vineyard wine is from a grower's vineyard called Coddington, which in fact we now lease. So we lease that from the new owners and run that vineyard basically as if it were our own.
Okay.
We have Hunting Hill and we have Maddie's Vineyard as well in the single vineyard range. But everything else, what goes into the estate wine is a blend of fruit that comes off our own vineyard and some growers as well, but only in Kumeu. And again, those growers are growers in an independent right, but we do quite a lot of the viticultural work and a lot of the advising, so we feel very comfortable using the word estate when it comes to that particular wine because it's very much under our control.
Yeah, because it truly is a family operation. I know that we're speaking to you, of course, and you conducting winemaking. But tell us a little bit about everyone else's role, your siblings and family.
Sure. Well, Dad started the company, and it really was the head of that. And he unfortunately died quite young in 1992, and survived by my mother Melba, who's now 83, but still very much involved in the business and loves to talk to people and to sell wine whenever she can. I'm the eldest in the family. I look after the winemaking side of things. Mariana comes next in the lineup, and she joined us a number of years ago and looks after some of the marketing, but a lot of the administration and finances, and but very much involved in marketing as well. Milan is a chemical engineer by trade, but he looks after all the vineyards, but also all the engineering aspects of the business, and very important role there. And the viticulture is really the key to our success, because without the grapes you can't do anything. And Paul, the youngest member of the family, is in charge of marketing and sales. But we all kind of delve into each other's fields, if you like, of expertise, and it's very much a cooperative family business. And, it works extremely well.
No, it's a joy to see. I've actually got an inset of your mother of
Yep.
Sitting there with a price list of the different wines that you have at the tasting room, which is fantastic.
A little bit out of date, but
well, we wanted to do everything that we could to make her look as good as possible. It was
well, actually, she looks very much along those lines still. but no,
Or the
the out-of-date
prices?
bit is the prices. Yeah.
Well, maybe one of these days we'll be able to, look at the Village Pinot Noir at $18. It's
Well, it still is actually. It's
really
that's one that hasn't changed. Yeah, Village Pinot Noir is still 18. Um, Sauvignon Blanc we now sell for 25. That comes from Hawke's Bay, so a new vineyard in the hill country in Hawke's Bay. We don't have the Melba anymore. That was a Merlot Malbec blend. The Merlot and the Malbec have gone and been replaced by, guess what, Chardonnay.
Was that on the Hawke's Bay vineyard as well, or is that
No, no. All of our Merlot and Malbec, those later ripening red varieties, they were all here in Kumeu.
okay?
What we've purchased in Hawke's Bay is a hill country property at about 180 meters altitude, and it's a lot cooler than say the Gimlet Gravels. So what we're growing there is early season, early ripening white and red varieties. So we have Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir on that block.
Yeah, and we didn't get a chance to really delve into that, the new project down there, because you're in the Triangles, just not too far from Gimlet Gravels.
We're out to the west of that,
Mhm.
but in the hills there's a couple of ranges of limestone hills, and we're on top of one of those ranges. So it's very much a limestone-based vineyard, and quite unique from that point of view.
Now, what do the grapes, specifically Chardonnay, comparing it to the Chardonnay at Kumeu, what are the characteristics of that? Because we just introduced the Raised Road Chardonnay to the U.S. market. So how does that, differ than what you'll find with the other single vineyards in Kumeu?
Well, all our vineyards here in Kumeu are clay-based, and so you get this kind of warmth and richness and earthiness coming from that, with some different terroir characteristics from the different vineyards as well. But what we get from that Hawke's Bay site, Raised Road, is very much an influence of limestone. And limestone does act a lot like clay in that it absorbs water, it makes water available to the vine as long as the roots are down in the soil profile, but it ekes it out. It doesn't, it's not like hydroponic viticulture. It's hard to get the water out. So the vines do survive, but they struggle a bit. But the limestone soil gives the wine a characteristic that, I can't explain why it does it, but it's there. And you see that effect in Burgundy and Chablis. These grapes that are grown on limestone have an electricity about them. There's a refreshing character on the palate that only seems to come from that type of soil. And that's what we're seeing with the Raised Road Chardonnay and the Sauvignon Blanc, and also the Pinot Noir, is this beautiful chalky texture, very vibrant, almost salty acidity on the palate that has that electric feel, and it's quite exciting, and we're really happy with it.
Yeah, and that's something I noticed with the Village Pinot Noir when it was released last year into the market. I mean, there was, it was very tightly wound up, in a way that I hadn't seen other New Zealand Pinot Noirs. A little bit more forgiving, for lack of a better term. But when it started to open up, and it took about a year to do that, all of a sudden you got to see, and you hate to use the term Burgundian, but there was this great mix of bright upfront fruit with that energy. We always talk about that tension in wines. It's a nice little surprise.
Are you talking about the 2018 vintage of Village?
Correct.
Is that the one? Yeah, okay. 2018, we had quite a bit of bad weather early in the season here in Kumeu, and we didn't actually harvest any Pinot Noir in Kumeu. We just left it behind. So, in fact, that 2018 Village wine is 100% from that new vineyard in Raised Road. So that character you're talking about is all about that vineyard and that soil type. With subsequent vintages, we've got a majority of the wine coming off that Raised Road vineyard, but some coming from our Kumeu vineyards as well, which has added a little bit more weight and texture in the mid palate, but it still has that vibrancy and that chalky tannin on the palate.
That makes sense. So, of course, this is something that you're a specialist in, and arguably one of the most knowledgeable people on earth, and that's about the use of yeasts. with it being your thesis to begin with. So, what got you on this bandwagon, way back in the 80s in terms of utilizing wild yeast instead of, either, a commercial yeast? And have you ever experimented with commercial yeasts after going full wild yeast?
Well, it really goes back to my time at Roseworthy and the vintage I did in 1981 at Mildara in Coonawarra. And it occurred to me at the time, because we were using the limited number of pure yeast cultures that were available on slopes from the Australian Wine Research Institute, there were varieties of yeast like 729, 350, 796. And we were making some pretty outstanding Cabernet wines from Coonawarra. And early on, after the fermentation, often it was easier to recognise what yeast strain had been used rather than which the vineyard was, or even what the variety was when you compared it with Shiraz at the time. So it just seemed to me that the yeast at that stage was having too much of an effect. And of course, came back home and we were using selected cultures as well, trying to pick the best yeast culture for the vineyard and tailor it that way. But I then had the opportunity to go and work in France and worked for Jean-Pierre Moueix in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. And at that time, it was all wild yeast. So I got to see firsthand how wine could be made without adding yeast at all. And it was truly a revelation, because, you just did nothing, just aerated the juice a little bit in the first 3 pump overs, added some diammonium phosphate as yeast food, and the rest just happened by itself. And it was quite an interesting progression through the fermentation of these amazing characters. But then at the end of it all of those yeast characters faded into the background, and it was the grape variety and the terroir that came through. So that was in 1983. Came home, and in 1984 we experimented for the first time with red wine and with Merlot, quite appropriately, and it worked. It just made an outstanding wine that went on to do very good things for us. We didn't tell anybody we were doing it, because I don't think anybody would have believed us at the time, and it would have been just seen as a bit more wacky coming out of our winery. But then in 1986, we had the confidence to try it for the first time with white wine. I always thought it was going to be a little bit dodgy with white because it's more delicate. But Millen and Nigel Tibbetts, who works with me as a winemaker as well, said, look, it's worked with the reds. Let's try it on the Chardonnay as well. And it worked a treat again. And each year you learn more about it and how to nurture it. And it's just a nice progression of yeast species. It's not dominated by one species or any one strain. Within Saccharomyces cerevisiae itself, which is the only species left at the end of fermentation, there's at least 80 or 90 different strains of that available as well. So what it means is that no one strain dominates. You don't get a particular yeast character coming through as the signature of the wine. In fact, the yeast character retreats into the background and allows the grape variety and the terroir to come through. And that I think is pretty evident in our wines.
Well, talking about in many ways, the next step, going from that initial, yeast, that fermentation, one of the biggest challenges that, many of us as we're going through and blind tasting and tasting wines in general is being able to determine whether or not it's oak treatment or lees treatment, whether or not it's Sur Lee. So if you can, just walk us through what that chemical process and change is, for the for secondary lees and additional lees aging.
Sure. Well, you're talking about two different things here, because in the first instance you have a barrel, and there are certain things in the oak that can affect the wine and can leach into the wine and affect the aroma and flavour. And a lot of that depends on the provenance of the barrels themselves, how they're made, but also their age. So we have quite a few wines where we have 20% new oak, and that contributes characters that are mostly vanilla type characters or hazelnut characters, which definitely are derived from the oak. What comes from the yeast and the yeast lees and the aging of the yeast are things that are absorbed into the yeast cell during fermentation and then re-released through the process of autolysis as the wine ages. And those characters can be bready type characters. They can be more textural characters as well. And a lot of the compounds, the fatty acids, the mannoproteins that come from the breakdown of yeast as well, contribute to that, what you could describe as non-sugar sweetness. It's the textural sweet character of the wine without being sugar. And I think that there are two distinctive types of character that will go into wine. One is from the infusion of the oak itself. The other is derived from the autolysis of yeast. Now, barrels are very effective in getting that yeast character into wine because they're a smaller container and you have more surface area of wine in contact with the yeast. And you also have the ability quite easily to stir that barrel and to get the yeast back into suspension so that you can augment the absorption of those yeasty characters. The barrels are also, the barrel character can be moderated by the presence of yeast. So the yeast on the surface of the barrel and during the fermentation moderates the absorption of those vanilla or woody characters out of the oak and makes them a bit more integrated. So the barrel fermentation model is actually a very nice integrated way of getting complexity into wine, both from the yeast and from the oak, but in a moderate way. In the old days, we used to make wine in stainless steel tanks and then age it in barrels. And what happened then was that you didn't have the yeast. You only had bright wine with quite a high alcohol content going into barrels, and all you did was extract some very harsh tannins, yellow colours, and generally ended up with over-oaked wines. So by having the fermentation in the barrel, having the yeast present in the barrel for most of or in fact all of the aging, you end up with a much more mellow and integrated product in the finish.
So with each of the, say, let's just take the levels of Chardonnay, do you find yourself playing around with, more aggressively stirring with some of the blocks as opposed to others?
No, we started out doing quite a regular stirring regime where it would be, twice a week, straight after fermentation, lowering down to once every 2 weeks and once every 3 weeks. Now we do it really on demand. So we're actually tasting the wines and stirring when we feel that the wines need it. Often when they're starting to show a little bit of acetaldehyde or oxidation, you give the barrel a quick stir and it seems to clean everything up. So it's not something that we look for different styles or anything like that. But where we do make quite a difference is in the proportion of new oak.
Okay.
So our better vineyards always get more new oak. Maddie's Vineyard typically will have about 30% new barrels, Hunting Hill and Coddington about 25% new oak, and the estate wine has about 20% new oak. And those are very rough numbers. The village wine has no new oak, and for the first two vintages, the Rays Road has not had any new oak either. So old barrels, I think, give a wonderful character and texture without the distinctive oak characteristics. And that's the kind of manipulation that we have. And also the provenance of the barrels. We do choose particular sources and particular makers of barrels for particular properties. And they are chosen to suit the particular characters that we get off those vineyards.
I see. One thing that I know that we and I have had this discussion is the topic of malolactic conversion. And, everyone's got a different approach to it, but I think your terroir and what you're dealing with and the raw material that you have, you've got a slightly different philosophy on it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yep. Well, I had learned about malolactic fermentation at college, and in those days, most of the discussion around it was about red wine. But we also then found out that most champagne and an awful lot of white Burgundy goes through this process as well. So because we're in a very cool climate region and we can get markedly high total acidity levels, we looked at it from a purely a de-acidification point of view to make the wine more palatable. And the early experimentation was back in the early 80s. You're getting some bacteria, trying to get the right bacteria. A Leuconostoc enos, which has now changed names to Enococcus. But the conversion is to take malic acid, which under our conditions can be quite high. It can be 3 grams per litre and higher, and convert it into lactic acid. And lactic acid tastes different. Lactic acid is the acid of milk. Malic acid is the acid of apples. Think Granny Smith apples. So you're getting a softening of the acidity, a reduction in the total acidity, and a rise in the pH. And so the wine becomes a bit softer and a bit more palatable. But what, of course, also happens is you get byproducts. And the main byproduct that we all like to talk about is the diacetyl, which is the butteriness. Now, diacetyl is a compound that's found in dairy products. So milk, cream, ice cream, cheese, butter would not taste the same if it wasn't for the diacetyl. You take the diacetyl away, they just don't taste right. But we started to get this character in the wines, and of course some people loved it, other people didn't quite so like it. We've moved away from having our wines particularly buttery these days, and I think the wines are better for it. Initially we thought that the malolactic conversion was actually affecting flavour and texture and aroma, but it became clear to us when we had an accidental malolactic in some Pinot Gris, and then followed by a subsequent re-fermentation, another primary fermentation, that all the diacetyl does is put up a mask, and you have a buttery character that masks everything else. If you then remove the diacetyl, the fruit comes back. And that's what we try to do now, is that we will get bacteria that produce quite a bit of diacetyl, but then by keeping the wine in contact with the yeast leaves for an extended period of time, and some stirring as well, the yeast, even when they're dead, have an amazing capacity to absorb and consume the diacetyl, so that you end up with wines that aren't buttery at all. And that's a technique that we use now.
I see. So with you in the vineyard, because you're also using a specific trellising system.
Oh, sure.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about that and why you use it in Kumeu.
Okay. Well, in the early days, we had quite agricultural-like production here of grapes. Our rows were a single rows, but about 12 feet apart, and for no other reason than to accommodate your standard agricultural tractor down the middle. And also all the foliage on either side used to be quite dense. So in order to alleviate the density of the foliage, my studies back at Roseworthy, I worked a lot with Dr. Richard Smart. He was my supervisor in my third year. The project looking at divided canopies. We were looking at GDC at the time.
Okay.
But a Geneva double curve.
Yeah.
But when I came back home, looked at the possibility of using a divided canopy to alleviate the shading problems that we had within our existing canopies. And the best way to do that was to separate the canopy. So you can see behind me, that's a lyre trellis. And instead of the GDC being trained like that and then the shoots going downwards, here you have the canopy being divided and the shoots growing upwards. We still have the roughly 12-foot separation between the rows, but you have a divided canopy in there helping to alleviate that high shoot density. I'll just turn the camera around and show you exactly how that works.
Oh, great.
So you have the vine divided, and at the top, that's about 5 feet apart. At the fruiting wire level, it's about 4 feet apart. So there's a slight angle on each side of the canopy. and we are cane pruning all these now. We started out spur pruning, but we got too much fungal disease in the old wood, so we've gone to cane pruning. This works very well. And then the shoots as they grow are trained up and caught with those catch wires. So we end up with not as anywhere near as high a density within each half of the canopy as we used to get when it was just a single row. Now, you can achieve exactly the same result by having closer rows, but at the time we didn't have narrow tractors or tractors that could go over the top of the rows, so we were stuck with our existing equipment, which we then modified to be able to cope with this trellis. We can trim the vines down the sides and down the middle as well, so we have a machine that can go down and do that, but we get very good separation, very good exposure, and then the fruit zone is also very well exposed to the sunlight, sometimes requiring a bit of leaf plucking, but not too much.
So when was the vineyard here planted?
This one was planted initially in the early 80s,
Okay.
so 1982, 83, and then it was replanted at the end of the 90s. So about 2000, I think, was the replant date for most of this particular vineyard. And the reason we replanted it largely was because of virus disease, because we had quite a bit of leaf roll virus in the property.
See.
And replanting with some high health material on low vigor rootstocks really made a huge difference to the quality of the grapes that we're getting off it. And now this vineyard is just outstanding. It's one of it is the first Chardonnay table wine vineyard we harvest each year. It comes off very ripens early, and as you can see, it's the first one to lose its leaves as well. Compared to Maddie's vineyard, which I'll show you there, you can see there's a lot more leaf on there because that does have some leaf roll virus in it. It delays the ripening by about 2.5 weeks, but we still get amazing flavors and textures and aromas from that vineyard anyway.
Yeah, it's the mustard yellow that you find in those vine in the leaf color. It's tremendous.
Yep.
So, I guess one more question. We didn't talk about necessarily clonal selections that you have in the vineyard, and with the disease that you've had over the past 20 years. Were you where do you see yourself going? Is it going to still be the same clonal selections that you've had over the past 40 years, or do you see yourself replanting with other clonal selections of material that haven't been introduced?
We did a lot of experimentation and a lot of replanting because of problems that we had. But once you've planted a vineyard and you've had it for a number of years, you start to realize the benefit of vine age. And as these vineyards get older, they just get better and better. So we're very reluctant to replant something that's working well. And Maddie's vineyard, because of its leaf roll virus, we were convinced 10 years ago we were going to have to replant that, but it just keeps getting better and better. And in fact, the only major problem we have now with parts of it is trunk disease. And parts of the vineyard will have to be replanted, and we have to think very carefully about what we're going to replant it with. Because if we introduce virus-free Mendoza clone Chardonnay, it will ripen earlier. So we'll start to have to harvest that block at different times if we're going to go that way. Or we could replant it with exactly the same material, and it will, after a few years, start to show the same type of characters.
I see.
But we have a number of different clones. Hunting Hill is exclusively clone UCD15, which is very well performed in New Zealand. It's a clone that was imported originally by Professor Warren Moran, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but he was doing a sabbatical at the University of California at Davis and talking to Austin Goheen and Harold Olmo, wanted to take the opportunity to bring some superior clones back into New Zealand, and thanks to him, clone 15 was imported. But we have a number of the newer French clones now, clones 95 and 96. We have clone 548, which is very, very encouraging. 1066, which is another Mendoza-like Chardonnay, very intense, but has even worse Métirondage than the Mendoza does. So you don't want to have too much of that in your vineyard. And we have clone UCD6, which always goes into the village wine because you don't get the intensity with that clone. We have a clone from Bordeaux, of all places, called 8021, which is also very good, but it came from the INRAS station, the experimental station. It's not actually grown commercially in Bordeaux, of course.
I see. Now, with the myriad of different clonal selections and raw material, how would you describe the three single vineyards from an organoleptic standpoint?
Well, they're all quite distinctive. If we start with the Coddington, very early on that showed that it was able to ripen extremely well. It's quite a warm site. It faces north, which in this hemisphere means warm, and it gets to a ripeness level where the main fruit characteristics are stone fruit, so much more in the yellow-fleshed peach and apricot spectrum, quite ripe and textural, but still having a very piercing acidity. And we matched that up with barrels that are very smoky and toasted. So we use exclusively Gillet barrels, which augment that. So you get that kind of vanilla, cream, peach character in that wine, which is very distinctive and very, very true to its terroir. We see that character year in, year out. Then we have Hunting Hill, where I am, also clone UCD15, but clean and free of virus. The Coddington does have a little bit of leaf roll virus in it, and it does reduce yield from that point of view, and probably contributes to that extra degree of ripeness. The Hunting Hill ripens very early, and the major characteristics here are citrus. So you get lime and lemon and a very floral, white flower type of character. So on the mid palate, it's warm and textural, but it's got an amazing length of mineral acidity and zestiness, and a bit of that salty tang as well that I mentioned before that we get from the limestone. This vineyard doesn't face directly north. There's parts of it that do, but most of it is kind of to the west and a little bit to the south. And the sea is not far away, so maybe that saltiness comes a bit from there, but it definitely has that distinctive character. And just tasting the 2020 out of barrel now, it's got a real citrus peel type of character, lemon, but also that pink grapefruit type of character. Very, very unique.
Wow.
Matty's Vineyard down on the flat just in front of me doesn't have initially that kind of distinctive fruit character, either peach or lemon. It's much more, I guess, pip fruit. You get that kind of pear-like character, a bit more oak, but then with age, it just reveals itself slowly, and you get much more complexity and some beautiful textural notes and tannin. Because of the Métirondage, you get quite small berries, and when we press those, the tannin levels can be quite high, and that really comes out with age. And a lot of that richness and across the mid palate that develops with bottle age as well is due to the right kind of tannins being grown in the vineyard in the first place, but then being extracted by the technique that we use, which always involves harvesting by hand, followed by whole bunch pressing very carefully so that we get the best possible quality juice. And that Matty's 2014 was an outstanding year, and you do start to see in those, as it ages a bit, the peach characters come out a bit more, but it's not quite as evident when it's a young wine.
Yeah, it is a little, it's certainly tightly wound up, but most great wines that have the capacity to age often have that characteristic early on in their lives. Well, yep. This has been fascinating, and I was going to say, is there anything that you want to tell everyone out there? Maybe something new that's going on at the winery, a certain project.
Well, we're just delighted with the 2020 harvest. We were very fortunate because it was a bit early this year. It was about 7 to 10 days early. that we were able to actually get all the grapes in the winery and get everything processed before our lockdown came into effect. A lot of our colleagues further south are still harvesting and still having to go in and hand harvest and do things in the winery under very strict safety conditions, and I really feel for them. So we've been very lucky this year, but by all accounts, all around the country, the harvest has been fantastic. I mean, we thought 2019 was a good year, and it really is, but 2020 is going to be one out of the box as well. We're just about to start bottling the single vineyard 2019s, and
Okay.
just looking at those in the tank now, they are awesome. Next week, we're going to be bottling Matty's Vineyard in Coddington, and then the following week, we get into Hunting Hill in a number of different bottle formats. So we have half bottles and magnums as well. But it's really exciting to see how that wine has come together from a fantastic year. And the real key to it was the ripening season was very dry. So we were free of rot. The grapes are able to ripen slowly, but just about perfectly. And the characters that we're seeing are ones that I think are going to last in the bottle and develop beautifully for a very long time.
Well, I can't wait to see those here in the fall, and maybe I'll be able to grab a couple of magnums and enjoy those in my old age, because there's no.
Don't leave them too long. Don't leave them too long, though. 4 or 5 years is fine.
Well, I'll find a couple of friends. I'm sure that everyone will be willing to drink a few glasses out of a Magnum with me once we get back to normal. Well, again, thank you so much. The
Pleasure.
information's been phenomenal. Thanks for walking us around the vineyards, and hopefully we'll be able to get over to the other side of the world soon. And you the same.
Yeah. And thanks very much for everything that you and Wilson Daniels do for us too. I mean, you do a great job, and things like this, to get our message out there in front of people is just marvelous. So thanks very much for doing it.
Cheers. It's the least I
cheers.
can do. Well, thanks again for everybody, checking in on us, and look forward to the next IG Live, where we'll talk to yet another one of our winery partners in the portfolio. Cheers. Be safe. Much love. Enjoy breakfast, Mike.
Thank you.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Catch you later.